There's no singular person that can be blamed for the Second World War, but the man who started the war in Europe in 1939 was without a question Adolf Hitler. And although he hardly did it on his own, it would not have happened without him. His generals were opposed to the war. They wanted more time to recruit, train, and equip the Wehrmacht, and they also remembered the Great War all too well. His economists were opposed. They knew what the Great War had done to the German economy, and they too wanted time to produce and build more. His diplomats were also opposed. They warned that if he continued his aggressive actions against Poland, England, and France, against Poland, England, and France would declare war on Germany. His people, even including some of his own Nazi party, were opposed. Like the generals, they remembered the Great War, and everyone feared fighting on two fronts. Now, Hitler was able to avoid fighting on two fronts initially with his August 23rd alliance with Stalin, that Soviet German non-aggression pact. Then he went ahead and plunged on into conflict. His action was predetermined. The whole point to his moves in the Rhineland or Austria, Czechoslovakia, of rebuilding the Wehrmacht and walking out of the League of Nations was to rewrite the Versailles Treaty. The appeasement as a policy had the same goal, and by the 1930s, the Allies had decided the treaty was unfair to Germany and were willing to modify it. One part of the Versailles that Hitler and his people hated the most was the creation of that Polish corridor, that strip of land that ran through Germany, separating East Prussia from the rest and taking the port of Danzig away from Germany and giving it to the Poles as a seaport. But Hitler wanted more than just the port of Danzig for Germans. He wanted more than just to rewrite the Versailles Treaty. He was a conqueror. He lusted for power, and he used it ruthlessly to create a mobile, offensive-oriented army. He wanted to not just settle old scores from the First World War. He also wanted to create a master race, a German Reich, that was to be just as much ideological as it was practical. Like Napoleon, he soon became too fond of war and kind of got victory disease and from winning so many battles and occupying so much land. And also, like Napoleon, he came to believe that he was almost invincible or a military genius. Uh, he had even other similarities to Napoleon. He was born outside of the nation that he led into war. Hitler was Austrian. And just like Napoleon, he kind of fed off the ineptness of his enemies in Moscow, Paris, London, and Washington, who were reluctant to fight. Hitler boasted that he had an army such as the world had never seen, which he really didn't. Even Hitler's generals told him that not until 1942 or to 1943 would the Wehrmacht be as totally prepared as he claimed it was in 1939. But his claim was believed, which was what counted, and his boast and his bragging and showmanship of their army terrified the British and the French, while Americans had unilaterally disarmed and were incapable of playing even a minor role in European affairs, really. But one of the great myths of the war is that England slept while Hitler rearmed, when in fact the British and the French spent as much as the Germans on rearmament. It was just that they bought the wrong weapons and had inferior military doctrines for employing them. The mystique of the Wehrmacht was kind of symbolized in two new weapons, the Stuka dive bomber and the tank. They made possible the new Blitzkrieg tactics or lightning war. The Stukas could protect the flanks of tank columns penetrating far behind the enemy front lines. When the columns joined, the enemy was surrounded and had to surrender. It wasn't just the Nazis' equipment and their vehicles and their planes, even though they were formidable. It was their philosophy. Blitzkrieg, which used radio-controlled communication as good as the world had ever seen. The Stukas would come in and pound the enemy from the sky. The tanks would come striking through, and then the infantry would follow it up and finish it off. So it was just as much, again, the philosophy as it was the equipment. Anyway, this use of tanks an independent role was first developed by English officers, actually, but was rejected by the British and French armies that held the role of tanks as just simply ways to support infantry. It's interesting that Hitler actually adopted this philosophy to use tanks in their own way. You know, the British and the English, most of the people in the military they still saw tanks as just a way to, support infantry. They didn't concentrate them into their own columns like the Germans did. So this is why Hitler believed that his new weapons and his new doctrines would kind of scare the British and the French, and this is why he continued to bully the Polish people in 1939. But with the completion of the Nazi-Soviet alliance, he was ready to strike. He didn't have to fear the Soviets coming in and attacking him while he was trying to invade the Poles. When London and Paris finally gave a guarantee to the Polish people and warned Hitler that if he invaded Poland, they would declare war on Germany, Hitler didn't believe them. And realistically, had London and Paris stiffened before Munich and Czechoslovakia, this may not have happened. A lot of the things that happened in the 1930s, Hitler even admitted himself, such as going into the Rhineland region, and he said if the French and the British would have mobilized, the Germans would have tucked and ran back to Germany. He was just testing them. And he believed by 1939, they weren't going to do anything. To make matters worse for the Polish, not only did they have sheepish allies, they had a poorly equipped army. They were outmanned, they were outgunned, out-equipment philosophy. The Germans were better, and they didn't really have a defensible border. And to make matters even worse, the Poles didn't really have any natural defense either. It was mostly a flat plains that the Germans got to roll their tanks through, which obviously made an even greater advantage for the Germans. So on September the 1st, Hitler finally struck at 4:45 a.m. 250,000 men and 60 German divisions, 9 of them armored, rumbled toward Warsaw, and under several excellent generals, which we'll hear more in the future, Heinz Guderian and Fedor von Bock, the Germans attacked the Polish in 3 different pincers. They had a weak center, which rushed straight toward Warsaw, and then on the 2 flanks, you had other German invasions. So they basically surrounded and closed in on Warsaw. The Poles fought bravely, though. They're brave, but basically ancient forces and equipment led by Marshal Edward Raditz, the Polish commander, were quickly encircled by the German tanks and then squeezed. In just a matter of weeks, Poland would be, conquered by the Germans. Luftwaffe planes, Stuka dive bombers with their terrifying, screaming Jericho trumpets smashed Polish towns and cities. But the Poles resisted. I mean, they resisted pretty heavily, even with their old-fashioned infantry, lancers, and armor, which ultimately proved useless, but they put up a very brave defense of Poland. On September 3rd, France and Britain declared war on Germany, and they went into full mobilization, but failed to do the one thing they could have done to help Poland: immediately invade Germany from the west and force Hitler into a 2-front war. Once again, they were sheepish, and I don't know exactly why they didn't do it. Maybe they were more concerned about defending their own countries and not so much Poland. And on that same day, in September the 3rd, German Foreign Minister Ribbentrop invited the Soviet government to move into Poland from the east. So Poland became a meat grinder, wedged in between 2 ruthless dictators, Hitler from the west and Stalin from the east. The Polish government fled Warsaw to Lublin on September the 6th. And on the 17th, surrounded by thousands of refugees riding everything from hand barrows to fire engines to even wheeling their children around in wheelbarrows, the government crossed the Romanian border and eventually established itself in Paris and then London, the first exile government, which there would be a lot more of them before the end of World War II. And on September 17th, a Polish ambassador in Moscow, Russia, was handed a note announcing that the Soviet-Polish Non-Aggression Pact, which was signed earlier, was void, basically saying a Polish state no longer exists, and the Red Army was moving in to protect white Russian and Ukrainian minorities in Poland. Poland was betrayed on both sides, but that's okay. Russia's going to be, or the Soviets, they're gonna get karma from this, because in the future Hitler will go back on the German Soviet non-aggression pact. But the Polish people fought on. They starved. There was very little food. There was just absolute carnage all around them. Um, Trenches were dug in the outskirts of town. They were just doing everything they could to defend their home. But the end came on September the 28th, when eventually the Polish were conquered. In Moscow, Ribbentrop and Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov signed a treaty, completing Poland's partition in 2 centuries. And the Germans took 71,000 square miles to the west, and the Soviet Union took about 75,000 to the east. The Germans admitted to killing over 10,000 and claimed to have 450,000 prisoners. Stalin also executed some 15,000 Polish leaders. All of them were anti-communists. So while Stalin was murdering Polish officers, Hitler was slaughtering Polish Jews, Gypsies, Socialists, and Democrats, which would be kind of a sign of things to come in the future. Between September of 1939 and May 1945, Poland suffered over 550 million deaths, overwhelmingly civilian, almost 20% of the population. But as we'll see, Poland is just the beginning. Even though they suffered more losses and more carnage than anybody in the conflict, this was unfortunately just the beginning of the terror for the Poles. They had to deal with the Soviets on one side, the Germans on the other. Just the absolute slaughter of their civilians, especially Jews. Concentration camps and railroads were ran from Germany into Poland to take the people to their work camps, or some of them to their final resting place. But the invasion of Poland, some people claim it officially kicked off the war, but even though technically we know that it had been brewing before this, France and Britain reluctantly declared war on Germany. They should have opened up that second front, but they didn't. But nonetheless, this is the invasion of Poland. Now Hitler has one of his prophecies fulfilled in that so-called Lebensraum that he wanted. But little does Stalin realize at this point, and apparently he didn't read Mein Kampf, he's next later in the war. But Hitler has a little bit more business to take care of back in the West, which he'll eventually conquer France. And the Soviets will look to secure themselves too in the Baltic areas when they invade Finland.